Mason Keene had 6 days left before the bank took the last thing with his name on it. Evelyn Langford, the CEO of one of the largest aerospace corporations in the Pacific Northwest, placed a check on the table in front of him. $2 million. Every cent of his debt cleared before dawn. No lawyers, no witnesses. One condition, written on a single page inside a black envelope. Mason read it once. His face did not change, but his hand closed slowly around the edge of the paper. He slid the check back across the table and walked out. Evelyn did not stop him, because if Mason ever said aloud what was written on that page, the Langford empire could fall. If you believe some prices are too high no matter how deep the debt, stay with Mason until the truth wins. The house outside Seattle was the kind of place that held its shape through stubbornness rather than wealth. A craftsman with a replaced porch board, gutters cleaned by hand, a workshop in the back where Mason Keene had once spent Saturday mornings teaching his daughter how to read metal grain with her fingertips. 3 months earlier, a bank representative had walked through that workshop with a clipboard, assigning liquidation values to dripper presses and surface grinders that Mason and his late wife had spent nearly 2 decades selecting piece by piece, each machine representing a contract won, a standard met, a name that meant something in the Everett Aerospace corridor. The business was gone before winter. The machines were still waiting for auction, and 18 former employees had moved on. Most of them quietly, a few of them angry, all of them owed more than severance paperwork could capture. Mason was left holding a $2 million personal loan he had used as collateral when Langford Aerospace offered Keene Precision Works a long-term production contract. The kind of contract that was supposed to justify the new line, the new lease, the risk that looked reasonable on paper when his wife was still alive to review it with him. 6 days remained before the bank would move on the house itself, the last asset still under Mason's name, the place where Sadie still believed her father was simply dealing with paperwork. He had not told her the full shape of what was coming. He had driven her to stay with his younger sister under the explanation that he needed a few days to sort through some filings, which was accurate in category but empty of weight. Sadie was 13 and perceptive and probably understood more than she let on, but she also knew that certain silences from her father were not an absence of information, but the act of carrying it alone, the way he always had, the way her mother used to gently argue against, without ever fully winning. Mason had not been a man who asked for help before the business collapsed, and he was not practicing at it now. 3 days before the bank's final deadline, Langford Aerospace sent a request, not formal, not legal, but not optional either, asking Mason to come to their headquarters in downtown Seattle. The reason given was a technical consultation. During a ground test of Aquila X, Langford's flagship electric transport prototype, a wing mount bracket assembly had developed a pattern of microfractures visible only under high-resolution scan. No personnel were injured, but the implications were severe. A fracture pattern that appeared during ground stress could propagate catastrophically under flight load, and if the investigation connected those parts to Keene Precision Works, the project, worth more than $9 billion in projected contracts, would face immediate regulatory review. The component in question had been manufactured at Mason's facility, and the electronic approval record showed his signature authorizing the material batch, a signature he knew, with complete clarity, he had never placed, because he had refused that authorization after the alloy certification failed to match the test sample he had received. Mason had built Keene Precision Works on a principle his wife had once written in a notebook she kept above her desk, that precision was not a preference but a promise, and that a promise made to a machine carrying people had no acceptable margin for revision. He had repeated this to every new hire on their first day and had never found a reason to revise it himself. The alloy certification discrepancy he had flagged before Keene Precision closed was not a bureaucratic objection. It was the same instinct that had kept the shop's rejection rate below 1% for 11 consecutive years. An instinct calibrated not by ambition, but by the specific understanding that the things his facility made were attached to aircraft, and that aircraft carried people, and that people had families waiting for them to land. When he arrived at Langford headquarters, he was not taken to an engineering review room or a legal conference suite. He was taken to the top floor, where Evelyn Langford was waiting alone, with 2 documents placed on the table in front of her: a copy of his loan agreement and a bank check made out in his name for the full outstanding balance. Evelyn laid out the offer the way a person does when they have rehearsed a conversation they did not want to have: clear, precise, and without unnecessary warmth. Langford Aerospace would purchase the debt, retire it completely, cover the associated tax burden, and ensure that Sadie's home would remain untouched. In exchange, Mason would sign a 4-page disclosure statement confirming that Keen Precision Works had independently substituted an unapproved alloy for the certified material specified in the contract, that Mason had authorized the substitution himself to reduce procurement costs while his business was under financial strain, that the electronic signature process had been used internally to bypass the standard review checklist, and that no representative of Langford Aerospace had been informed of or involved in the material change. It was written cleanly, in careful legal language, and every sentence was a lie. Mason understood what the statement would accomplish before he had finished the second page. 3 months earlier, Miles Langford, Evelyn's younger brother and the company's vice president of product development, had called Mason directly and requested that production continue using a new material batch that had arrived at the facility without the standard certification package. Mason had refused, had documented the refusal in writing, had flagged the discrepancy to his production supervisor, and had placed a temporary hold on that portion of the manufacturing run. Shortly after, Langford Aerospace had suspended all payments to Keen Precision under the premise of a contract performance review that never produced a formal finding. Signing Evelyn's statement would absorb all of that into a narrative that ended at Mason's desk, with no thread remaining that pointed anywhere inside the Langford family. Evelyn spoke calmly about scale, about the 8,000 people employed across Langford's facilities, about the years of engineering investment behind Aquila X, about what a prolonged public investigation would cost a company already navigating a difficult market. She did not threaten Mason or raise her voice. She offered him a version of reality in which signing the statement was not dishonesty but pragmatism, the rational act of a man who had already lost everything except a house and a daughter, accepting money that would let him rebuild without the world ever thinking to question it. She even acknowledged obliquely that the situation had not been handled fairly on Langford's side, which cost her nothing and changed nothing about what she was asking. Mason asked one question before responding. What would happen to his professional certification and his ability to find work in aerospace after the statement became part of the regulatory record? Evelyn said the legal team could likely help him avoid criminal charges, but his career in the industry would effectively be over. He had spent 19 years building a reputation for precision and accuracy in a field where those qualities determined whether aircraft stayed in the air, and she was offering to erase the debt and end the career in a single document. Mason looked at the check one more time, then pushed it across the table with 2 fingers. The way you return something that was never really offered to you, only lent at a price you were supposed to be too desperate to calculate. He told her that $2 million in debt could take his house, but signing that statement would make his daughter believe her father was a man who lied when it was convenient. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left without waiting for a response. That same evening, Langford Aerospace issued a public statement naming Keen Precision Works as the most probable source of the non-conforming material in the Aquila X bracket assembly. The statement moved through local news quickly, carried by the gravity of a $9 billion aerospace program and the narrative simplicity of a bankrupt small business cutting corners to survive. Reporters did not investigate the claim so much as report the shape of it. A struggling manufacturer, a failed company, a man with documented financial pressure, and a motive that required no imagination. Mason's name appeared in 2 regional publications by the following morning, accompanied by the framing of a subcontractor whose financial circumstances might have influenced quality decisions. He read the articles once, in the parking lot of a grocery store, where he had driven to avoid sitting alone in the house, and then he put his phone in the center console and drove home without buying anything. The bank responded to the news by formally declining to extend his repayment window, citing increased risk of litigation entanglement. The regulatory body that issued his technical inspection certification placed it under administrative review pending the outcome of the Langford inquiry. A mid-size aerospace firm in Renton that had been in late-stage discussions with Mason about a consulting role withdrew the offer without explanation, sending a short email that read like something written by legal counsel rather than a hiring manager. Each of these outcomes arrived separately, over the course of 2 days, as though the world was confirming the arrangement Evelyn had described. Every door closing at exactly the moment Mason had chosen not to close himself behind one that would have paid off the debt. Evelyn had not orchestrated the media coverage directly, but she had not corrected it either, had not issued a clarifying statement, had not instructed her communications team to note that no determination of fault had yet been made. Miles had suggested the framing, and Harlan Cross, the company's chief financial officer, had approved it, and Evelyn's silence had allowed it to harden into the public understanding of what had happened. She would carry that silence as a specific weight for a long time afterward, distinct from the larger mistakes and more difficult to explain away, because silence during a calculated injustice is itself a choice, and she had been a person who knew how to make choices. Mason returned to Keen Precision 2 days later, using the key he had technically surrendered but which the bank's liquidation agent had not yet collected, to retrieve a set of personal tools and a photograph of his wife that had remained on the office wall. Cole Maddox was waiting at the loading dock, sitting on an overturned milk crate with a thermos of coffee, as if he had simply been there all morning and expected Mason to eventually appear. Cole had spent 17 years at Keen Precision, first as a machinist, then as floor supervisor, the kind of employee who knew the location of every file and the origin of every procedure without being asked. He had seen the news. He did not believe it. Cole told Mason he remembered the day the questionable alloy batch arrived. Remembered it specifically because Mason had personally ordered a production hold and drafted a written rejection notice before the end of that shift. According to the insurance documentation protocol, Cole had retained a sealed test sample along with a copy of the shift log for that week, materials that had never been transferred to Langford because the company closed before the insurance claim process was completed. When Cole opened the storage unit and showed Mason the sealed sample container, the lot code on the label did not match the material listed in the Langford-supplied contract documentation. More significantly, the shift log contained a notation in Cole's handwriting. A Langford representative had arrived at the facility after hours, spoken with 2 of the production crew, and requested that work on the bracket assembly continue despite the hold order Mason had placed. The name field on that entry had been partially obscured by water damage, but the initial remaining was clear: ML. Mason contacted Reese Calder, the company's general counsel, and asked whether she could arrange independent laboratory analysis of the sealed sample without routing it through Langford's internal testing process. The independent laboratory identified the alloy within 72 hours. It had been sourced from a smelting operation abroad, imported through a domestic distributor registered under the name Halcyon North America. Mason ran the company registration himself using the state business database and a request to the county clerk's office. Halcyon had no warehouse address, no listed employees, no active import license for aerospace-grade materials, and a registered agent address that corresponded to a mail handling service located in a commercial building owned by a private investment fund whose listed administrator was Harlan Cross. The delivery documentation Cole had retained allowed Mason and Cole to reconstruct the chain of custody in a single evening, working on the kitchen table of Cole's apartment with printed records spread across every available surface. The alloy shipment had arrived at Keen Precision during a night shift, transported by a carrier whose manifest listed no contract reference number from the Langford Master Agreement. The receiving signature on the delivery form bore the name of a machinist who had left Keen Precision 2 months before the delivery date. The payment for the material had not been processed through Keen Precision's standard accounts payable system, but through a separate wire transfer that Mason had never authorized and did not recognize, and the per-unit cost of the alloy was 38% below the market price for certified aerospace-grade material of the specified strength class. This was not a procurement error. This was a supply chain built in parallel, designed to avoid every checkpoint that would have flagged it. Evelyn had begun to move in her own direction before Mason found the Halcyon records. When she requested the original material warning logs from before the incident, her technology department informed her that the relevant records had been deleted in the course of Keen Precision's closure, an explanation she had initially accepted. Reese came to her office late one evening and placed a single printed paragraph on her desk, a section of the company's data retention policy specifying that no external vendor closure could result in automatic deletion of internal communications records. Someone had gone into the system and removed the data manually, using administrative credentials that only 4 people at the company held. Evelyn began replaying her conversation with Mason, not the one where she had offered him the check, but the version she had been running in her own memory since he walked out. A man who had genuinely authorized a fraudulent substitution and was watching his house disappear would not have pushed a $2 million check back across a table. People who are guilty and desperate do not refuse that kind of escape. She drove to the house herself, without a legal team or a settlement offer, and Mason met her at the door without letting her inside. He told her she had not come because she believed him. She had come because she had started to understand she had been protecting the wrong person. Evelyn said he was correct, without trying to make the admission sound like more than it was, and she asked whether there was a path forward that placed evidence in institutional hands rather than a private arrangement between 2 people who had no particular reason to trust each other. Mason told her that after her first offer, his trust also carried a price, and she could not afford it. Evelyn did not argue. She left a copy of the server access logs on Mason's front step the following morning, not as leverage, not as a gesture of apology, but as a transfer of information she had no legal right to withhold from the person most directly harmed by what it contained. Mason spent 4 hours working through the logs and found what he had suspected. His electronic credentials had been used to approve the alloy batch at 11:47 in the evening, on a date when he had been at a hospital in Bellevue, completing the final paperwork required after his wife's death. The access had occurred from a device previously registered to Keen Precision Works, a field inspection tablet that Miles Langford had borrowed during a site visit and returned the following afternoon. Mason considered, with full clarity, a version of the next several weeks in which he used what he knew as negotiating material, trading the evidence for debt relief and a cleared record, and walking away with his finances intact and his integrity technically preserved because no written lie had been signed. He could see the shape of that arrangement. He rejected it with the same clarity, because the difference between selling silence and selling a signature was a distinction that would not survive examination in the light of what Sadie might someday ask him about how he had handled the worst period of his life. He called Evelyn and told her he would work with her under 4 conditions: no private agreements of any kind. Every piece of evidence they developed would go directly to the regulatory authority without passing through Langford's internal legal team. If Mason's name was cleared, Evelyn would make that correction publicly in the same venues where her company's statement had made him culpable, and she would not protect Miles if the evidence led to him. Evelyn accepted all 4 conditions without negotiation, and she confirmed the 4th one quietly, the way a person confirms something already decided rather than something being decided now. Mason noted the difference because the difference was meaningful. A person negotiating from position hesitates on what costs them most, and Evelyn had not hesitated. They established a working space in Reese's personal office rather than anywhere on Langford property. A conference table intended for 3 people that became their operations center for the better part of a week. The work was methodical and repetitive in the way that assembling a technical case always is, not dramatic, not fast, requiring the same discipline as identifying a hairline fracture in a structural component, patience, precision, and the willingness to discard a hypothesis when the data does not support it. During that week, Evelyn mentioned once, without framing it as relevant to the investigation, that she had learned Mason had liquidated his personal tools and paid the proceeds to employees on his last payroll run. Mason mentioned once, without framing it as anything, that Evelyn had apparently been sleeping in the Langford building 4 nights a week since the fracture incident became public. Neither of them made anything of these observations beyond the acknowledgement that the other person was also not willing to walk away from something they believed in, even at significant personal cost. They found the device fingerprint linking the false authorization to Miles's private network on the 5th day, and before they could complete the extraction, Evelyn received a notification that her board access credentials had been suspended. Miles had moved quickly. He called an emergency session of the board of directors without notifying Evelyn, framing the meeting as a necessary response to what he described as a CEO who had allowed personal relationships to compromise her judgment in an active regulatory matter. Harlan produced a financial analysis showing that the longer the Aquila X program remained under scrutiny, the higher the risk to a pending acquisition agreement with Bancroft Capital, an investment group whose commitment was contingent on the program reaching its demonstrated flight milestone on schedule. Several board members had personal financial stakes in the Bancroft transaction that made the timeline something other than an engineering question. Harlan then placed on the table a record showing that an entity called Keene Industrial Consulting had received a wire transfer of $250,000 from Halcyon Metals, North America. The account name was close enough to Mason's former business to read as evidence of a corrupt arrangement, except that Mason had never seen that money, never operated a business by that name, and the tax identification number on the account did not match any entity he had ever registered. Miles had created the company to construct a financial motive, a paper trail suggesting Mason had been paid to introduce the non-conforming material and was now working with Evelyn to fabricate an alternative account of events. The board gave Evelyn a structured ultimatum: publicly distance herself from Mason and endorse the finding that Keen Precision bore sole responsibility, return operational authority for Aquila X to Miles, or face immediate suspension of her CEO designation. She asked for the room and sat with the ultimatum for 38 minutes. She had spent 11 years building toward the leadership of a company her grandfather had founded, had passed up acquisitions and personal opportunities to remain focused on a single institution she had genuinely believed she could make better than she had found it. The board was now asking her to repeat, under different labeling, exactly the offer she had made to Mason, to purchase a preferred outcome with the credibility of someone who had no stake in lying. She walked back into the boardroom and told them she would not sign a statement condemning Mason Keen, because the evidence she had reviewed indicated he was not responsible for what had happened, and because she had already made the mistake of asking him to do something she was unwilling to do herself. The board voted to suspend her executive authority and transfer interim operational control to Miles, effective immediately. A security officer accompanied her to her office to observe while she collected personal items. She carried a canvas tote and a single file box and walked through the lobby of a building with her family's name on the exterior facade, without looking at the reception area or the enormous Aquila X model mounted above the entrance. Mason was parked across the street. He said nothing about what she had given up. He simply opened the passenger door, and when she was seated, he told her they had 48 hours before the regulatory hearing that Miles and Harlan intended to use to close the investigation with a predetermined finding. Miles announced publicly that same afternoon that the Aquila X demonstration flight would proceed as scheduled. Mason filed an emergency advisory with the regulatory authority the following morning, co-signed by Reese in her capacity as the company's general counsel of record, noting that the evidence warranted a delay of any flight demonstration pending independent materials verification. The advisory was acknowledged but not acted upon immediately, because Miles had submitted his own engineering brief arguing that the fracture pattern was attributable to a machining error specific to Keen Precision's process, an error that had been isolated and would not recur in parts produced by a different supplier. To overturn that brief, Mason needed to demonstrate that the fracture had originated in the alloy's chemical composition, not in anything done during manufacturing. The sealed sample Cole had retained was the only uncompromised specimen available, and Mason requested that 3 independent materials laboratories be present simultaneously for the analysis, with a representative from the regulatory authority observing in person. Evelyn used 2 personal relationships: a former board member who had resigned the previous year and a university research director she had worked with on a certification project, to arrange the regulatory presence within 18 hours. The analysis ran for 6 hours. The results confirmed elevated impurity ratios in the alloy's silicon and manganese content that exceeded the threshold for structural aerospace application by a margin that was not ambiguous. The chemical signature matched reference samples from the foreign smelting operation that Halcyon Metals had used as its source. The fractures in the Aquila X bracket were not the result of how the parts had been machined, but of what the metal had been before it arrived at Keen Precision's facility. Miles responded by restating his position, that Mason had purchased material from a disreputable source, which proved negligence regardless of origin, but the argument was losing structural integrity in the same way the bracket had, not all at once but in accumulating detail. Cole, going through the storage records the insurance company had digitized but never formally reviewed, located a timestamp file from the forklift-mounted camera system the facility had used for inventory tracking. The camera had recorded continuously and uploaded to a server managed by the insurance carrier. The footage from the night the alloy was delivered showed 2 vehicles in the loading area after midnight. the delivery truck, and a personal vehicle whose license plate matched a registration belonging to Miles Langford. The recording showed Miles speaking with a second individual near the loading dock entrance for 11 minutes before production workers were directed to begin unloading. The individual matched the physical description of Harlan Cross. There was no audio, but the visual record placed Miles at the facility on the night of the delivery, categorically incompatible with the statement he had provided to the board claiming no knowledge of the Halcyon supplier. Sadie called Mason while he was reviewing the forklift footage on Cole's laptop. She told him the bank had delivered a notice that the final date for vacating the property was 3 days away. Mason told her he understood, that he loved her, and that he would explain everything when he saw her. He did not call Evelyn afterward to ask for a bridge loan or a temporary arrangement to protect the house. The house was a thing that could be rebuilt or replaced. The record of how he had handled this could not. Reese received word shortly before midnight that Miles had reclassified the regulatory hearing as a closed proceeding, with the witness list controlled by Langford's interim executive office. The closed proceeding was scheduled for 9 in the morning in a federal building in downtown Seattle, in a room that held 20 people and had been reserved under administrative language that effectively limited attendance to parties with prior authorization. Miles and Harlan had constructed the guest list over 3 days, populating it with Langford's internal engineering witnesses, the financial consultants managing the Bancroft transaction, and regulatory officers who had existing relationships with Langford's compliance department. Mason was listed as a respondent, which meant he could be questioned but not allowed to initiate the presentation of evidence without procedural approval. Evelyn walked in at 8:45 with Reese, who had drafted a formal intervention notice arguing that a general counsel of record could not be excluded from a proceeding involving an active regulatory matter concerning her client company without violating the entity's procedural rights. The presiding officer reviewed the filing for 12 minutes and allowed both of them access. Evelyn spoke before the session was formally called to order, identifying herself and stating clearly that she was appearing voluntarily to provide testimony directly relevant to the matter under review, and she began not with Miles but with herself. She told the room that Langford Aerospace had offered Mason Keene a payment of $2 million in exchange for a signed statement accepting sole responsibility for the alloy substitution. She confirmed the statement would have been false. She confirmed that at the time of the offer she had known her brother's involvement was a possibility she had not investigated. She stated that she had permitted her company's communications office to release characterizations of Mason that were not supported by the investigation's findings, and that she had not corrected those characterizations when she had both the authority and the information to do so. She said these things in sequence and without framing, because the only way the technical evidence would survive a controlled proceeding was if the implied motive for Mason's cooperation with her, that he was fabricating a defense to escape liability, was removed by Evelyn herself. She was not performing contrition. She was dismantling the argument before Miles could use it, which was a form of honesty made more credible by the fact that it cost her something visible to every person in the room. Mason presented the evidence in the order it had been developed. The written material rejection filed before Keene Precision closed. The hospital and parking records placing him away from any network connection at the time of the fraudulent authorization. Cole's sealed sample and chain of custody documentation. The 3 laboratory analysis results. The Halcyon Metals registration records linking the company to Harlan's investment fund. The forklift camera footage, and the Keene Industrial Consulting wire transfer records showing a tax identification number that had never been associated with any entity Mason had registered. Miles stated once, toward the end of the session, that the relationship between Evelyn and Mason made the entire evidence package suspect. Mason said he did not need Evelyn Langford to defend his evidence. The laboratory results were signed by 3 independent directors. The forklift footage was archived on an insurance server neither he nor Evelyn had ever accessed. The sealed sample had never left Cole Maddox's possession, and the timeline spoke without assistance. Reese placed the final document on the table. An internal email from Miles to Harlan, dated 2 weeks before the fracture incident, stating in its operative line that if anything went wrong with the bracket assembly, the Keen supplier should be positioned to absorb the full outcome. The presiding officer requested a recess. The Aquila X demonstration flight was suspended with 40 minutes remaining before its scheduled departure. Miles's removal from the interim executive role came within 24 hours of the hearing's conclusion, initiated by the regulatory authority, which forwarded the case materials to federal investigators and issued a formal notice that no operational decisions regarding Aquila X could be made by any individual connected to the material procurement process pending the investigation's outcome. Harlan's financial accounts were placed under audit. The parallel supply chain he had constructed through Halcyon Metals began to unravel the way paper structures always do when the first layer is removed. Each document pointing to another, each entity referencing another, the whole architecture visible once someone with authority decided to look directly at it. Their losses were subtler and more durable than a single moment of exposure. The removal of the authority they had used to make themselves untouchable, the public record of what they had built and why. The end of the specific protection that comes from being the person a powerful family chooses to defend. The board contacted Evelyn within 3 days and asked her to return as CEO. She declined immediately, telling them that a person who had offered to purchase a false confession from an innocent man should not resume leadership as though nothing requiring examination had occurred, and that she would cooperate fully with the independent audit being conducted into her own role in the decision to approach Mason. The audit took 11 weeks. Its findings distinguished between Evelyn's conduct, the offer itself, the silence during Mason's public characterization, and the decisions made before she turned toward transparency, and the conduct of Miles and Harlan, which involved active fabrication, financial fraud, and obstruction. Evelyn received a formal censure, lost a portion of her personal voting rights in the company, and was required to operate under a new oversight structure. She accepted these terms without appeal. Langford Aerospace's legal team conducted a review of outstanding obligations to Keen Precision Works and produced an accounting that covered unpaid production invoices from the final months of the contract, specialized equipment costs procured specifically for the Langford specifications, contractual penalty interest accrued since the unilateral payment suspension, and damages calculated against the documented causal relationship between Langford's payment freeze and the bankruptcy of Keen Precision. The total figure exceeded $2 million. Mason received the accounting from Reese, who noted in her cover letter that the payment was a legal obligation arising from an audited finding rather than a discretionary settlement. This distinction mattered to Mason in ways that were difficult to articulate but easy to act on. He used the funds to satisfy the bank, to repurchase a portion of the liquidated equipment at auction, and to make additional payments to the former Keen Precision employees, whose final compensation had been reduced by the bankruptcy process. He did this before he paid himself anything, not from performance but from the same instinct that had made him liquidate his own tools to cover the last payroll. The understanding that a business is not a building or a balance sheet, but the people who showed up and did the work, and that their claim on what was owed came before his own. The house survived the last deadline by a margin of 1 business day. When Evelyn met Mason in the parking structure near Reese's office after the final paperwork was signed, she told him the $2 million had now been paid without any conditions attached. Mason said she had misidentified what had happened. She had not paid his debt. Her company had returned what it had taken from his. The difference was not semantic. One was a gift that created an obligation. The other was a correction that created nothing except an accurate account. Evelyn said she understood and that she was sorry, and both statements were true, and they meant something different at that stage than they would have meant at any earlier point in the preceding months. 6 months after the hearing, the office that housed Keen Material Integrity occupied a converted unit in an industrial park on the eastern edge of Everett, 3 miles from the aerospace corridor where Mason had spent the most consequential years of his working life. The company employed Cole as operations director, 3 engineers who had previously worked in materials certification, and 2 documentation specialists from regulatory compliance backgrounds. The work was the kind that attracted no attention when done correctly and became extremely visible when it was not. Independent verification of material origins for aerospace components, with a mandate structured so that no client representative could alter a testing result or intercept a report before it reached the appropriate regulatory body. The Langford Aerospace contract specified every term Mason had negotiated before accepting it. He held the right to report findings directly to the regulatory authority without internal review. No executive of the client company could be present during testing. Individuals who raised concerns about test results were explicitly protected from retaliation under the contract's governing language. All data was stored on servers owned by an independent custodian, with copies held by the regulatory authority. Any material change from an approved design specification required sign-off from at least 3 authorized parties, none of whom could hold a financial interest in the outcome. These terms were not unusual in principle, but they were unusual in their precision, and they had been drafted by Mason personally in language that would not survive a reinterpretation intended to make them less inconvenient. Aquila X completed its revised safety certification program and passed. The timeline had extended by 14 months, which the Bancroft Capital Agreement ultimately survived after renegotiation, partly because the alternative of walking away from a program that had already generated $9 billion in downstream interest was more expensive than waiting. The program continued, and it continued with verified materials and an independent party whose sole function was to confirm that the verified and the actual were the same thing. Evelyn returned to the CEO role and worked under a governance structure that included an external safety ombudsman, quarterly materials audit reporting, and a whistleblower protection policy written with enforcement mechanisms rather than aspirational language. She had not recovered everything she had held before the suspension. She had not tried to. The authority returned to her was smaller in scope and more carefully watched, and she treated that reduction as the accurate cost of decisions she had made rather than as an injustice to be corrected. The board had expected her to fight the oversight conditions. She had signed them the same morning they were presented, which told the people watching her more about who she intended to be than any statement she could have issued. Mason did not immediately forgive what she had asked of him in that top-floor office, and he did not pretend to. Forgiveness, in his experience, was something that arrived after evidence, not before it, and the evidence of who Evelyn had decided to be required time to accumulate. In many months of working proximity, she did not attempt to purchase her way back into his regard. No gifts, no gestures calibrated for effect, only punctuality, consistency, and the keeping of commitments so small they would have been invisible if they had not been so reliable. At the opening of Keen Material Integrity's office, Sadie stood near the back of the small gathering and watched her father speak to a group of engineers and regulatory officials about the work the company would do and the standard it intended to hold. She was 13 and perceptive, and she understood more about the preceding months than her father had told her. Not because he had explained it all, but because she had been paying attention. After the event, Evelyn invited Mason to dinner and named one condition: no discussion of debt, contracts, or anything connected to Langford Aerospace. Mason considered it for a moment, recognized it as the first offer she had ever made him from which she had nothing to gain, and said it was something he could work with. He locked the door of the company that carried his name and walked back toward the life he had kept, not by signing anything, not by surrendering to anything, but by refusing, from the first moment a check was placed in front of him to the last document filed on his behalf, to let the price of his name be set by someone else's emergency.
Go in here. Is this the right way? I believe so. Did I go in that way, guys? Am I tripping? Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, you're right. Love this game. And Wu Chang. Wu Chang was different creators, right? Yeah. When you fight the bear